The cold air in the precinct break room felt like a sharpened blade against the back of Gary's neck. He stared at the bulletin board where a high-resolution glossy printout mocked his very existence. It was a close-up of a human foot. His foot. The lighting was unforgiving. The resolution was crisp enough to see every ridge of the bathroom tile. Below it, in a bold serif font that screamed corporate passive aggression, were 5 words. Gary's sole contribution to the team. The silence in the room was louder than a gunshot. He could hear the low hum of the vending machine and the distant tapping of keyboards. His professional reputation was bleeding out on a corkboard. This was the end game. This was the moment everything he had built over 30 years of impeccable service dissolved into a punchline. He felt the phantom vibration of his phone in his pocket. It was a digital ghost. A reminder of the moment he pushed the wrong button and invited the entire department into his bathroom. Let's go back to where the fuse was lit. It started with a piece of hardware. A sleek, brushed aluminum slab of silicon and glass that promised a seamless user experience. My father had been a loyalist to the open-source architecture of Android since the dawn of the smartphone era. He understood the file structures. He liked the granular control. But then he saw the marketing. He saw the ecosystem. He wanted the blue bubbles. He bought an iPhone. It was the latest model with the triple-lens camera system capable of capturing cinematic depth. It was a piece of military-grade technology in the hands of a man who still uses a physical magnifying glass to read a restaurant menu. I was the one who unboxed it. I was the one who initiated the biometric handshake. I migrated his data across the encrypted bridge. I thought I was being a good son. I thought I was bridging the generational gap. I didn't realize I was handing a live grenade to a man who didn't know how the pin worked. The first few weeks were deceptively quiet. He complained about the swipe gestures. He struggled with the haptic feedback. He kept asking where the back button went. I told him the screen was the button. I told him to trust the interface. Every time he hit a snag, he looked at me like I had personally rewritten the source code to spite him. If a call dropped, it was my fault. If the brightness auto-adjusted, I was the architect of his frustration. He viewed me as the lead developer of his personal hell. Then came the evening of the incident. I was at my desk, deep in a spreadsheet, calculating the quarterly margins for a high-stakes acquisition. My phone screamed on the mahogany surface. It wasn't a text. It wasn't a casual notification. It was an incoming voice call. In the modern era, a voice call from a parent is a signal of immediate distress. It is the digital equivalent of a flare gun. I answered with a knot in my stomach. I asked if he was okay. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask about my day. He spoke in the low, measured tones of a man who had just witnessed a hit and run. He told me I needed to come over immediately. He said there had been an incident. I asked him for a classification. Was it a medical emergency? Was there a breach of the home security system? He told me it was a photo incident. I asked if he was physically unharmed. He paused for a beat. He said he was physically fine. But his voice lacked conviction. He sounded like a man who had lost his soul in a cloud upload. I closed my laptop and grabbed my keys. I didn't even bother to save my work. The urgency in his voice suggested a catastrophic failure of the highest order. When I arrived at the house, the atmosphere was heavy. The lights were dimmed. My father was sitting at the kitchen table with the iPhone held out in front of him like it was a radioactive isotope. He didn't look up when I walked in. He just pointed at the screen. He opened the Messages app. He tapped on a thread. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the participant list. It was the departmental group chat. Every senior manager. Every junior analyst. The entire administrative staff. 15 people in total. And there, sitting in the middle of a stream of professional updates and meeting reminders, was a high-definition image of my father's bare foot. It wasn't a casual shot. It was a macro-lens study of the human anatomy. You could see the texture of the bath mat. You could see the plastic tears of his shower caddy in the background. It was an intimate portrait of a man's morning routine, shared with the people who determined his salary. I stared at the screen in a state of clinical shock. The composition was harrowing. The toes were fully extended against the cold porcelain. The lighting was harsh and fluorescent. It was a visual data dump of information no coworker should ever possess. My father explained the logic. He had developed a minor dermatological concern. A rash. A standard skin irritation. He wanted to consult my mother. He wanted a second opinion before seeking professional medical advice. He took the photo. He intended to transmit the file to his wife via a private, end-to-end encrypted channel. But the interface betrayed him. His thumb drifted. The proximity of the contacts in the sharing sheet created a fatal overlap. He tapped the work crew thread. He hit send. The data packets were dispatched. The damage was done. If you've ever felt the blood drain from your face when you realized you sent a private thought to a public forum, hit the like button. I need to know I'm not the only one who has felt this specific brand of digital vertigo. The situation escalated quickly. My father realized the error almost immediately. But instead of executing a standard undo, send, or a long press deletion, he panicked. He reverted to a primitive logic. He believed that the digital space operated on the principle of physical displacement. He thought that if he sent the same image again, it would somehow overwrite the first one. He thought the second photo would act as a patch for the first. Like a carpenter placing a new board over a rotten one. He lined up the shot again. He took a second photo from a slightly different angle. More arch. More heel. He sent it into the same chat. Now there were two distinct perspectives of his foot. It was no longer an accident. It was a gallery. It was a thematic exploration of his lower extremities. The group chat, usually a place for discussing project deadlines and office logistics, had become an exhibition space. I looked at him and asked the obvious question. Why did you send it twice? He looked me dead in the eye with a terrifying sincerity. He told me he thought the second one would replace the first. He used the word replace. He genuinely believed the software was designed to recognize a duplicate and merge the files. He thought he was editing his mistake in real time. I had to explain to him that the internet is an additive medium. It does not subtract. It only accumulates. Every message is a permanent entry in the ledger of your life. Every image is a digital footprint that never washes away. He had provided his colleagues with a stereoscopic view of his bathroom floor. The work crew was now in possession of more anatomical data on their supervisor than his primary care physician. The responses began to roll in. They were masterpieces of workplace diplomacy and subtle cruelty. His boss, a man known for his stoic demeanor and lack of humor, was the first to break the silence. He didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't express concern for the rash. He simply wrote, "Nice tile work, Gary." It was a surgical strike. It acknowledged the invasion of privacy while pivoting to the only safe topic in the frame. The bathroom renovation. It was the funniest thing I had ever seen a professional human being type under extreme duress. Another colleague sent a simple thumbs up emoji. It was ambiguous. Was it a sign of support? Was it a critique of the foot's structural integrity? Then came the voice of reason. A woman named Sarah replied with a two-word question. Wrong chat. It was a lifeline. A chance for him to retreat. An opportunity to claim a technical glitch. But my father refused to take the exit. He sat there in silence. He didn't respond to Sarah. He didn't apologize. He didn't even use the laugh reaction to play it off as a joke. He told me he didn't want to draw more attention to it. I had to point out the logical fallacy of his position. I told him, "Dad, there are 2 high-resolution photos of your naked foot in the thread. The attention has been drawn. It has been captured, processed, and archived. Silence isn't a strategy at this point. It's an admission of defeat. He then shifted the blame. He looked at me with a sudden flash of accusation in his eyes. He told me he thought I had set up the contacts wrong. He claimed the group chat shouldn't even have been an option in the share menu. He was trying to litigate the initial setup of the device. I had to defend my technical integrity. I told him I did nothing but sign into his Apple ID. I was just the facilitator. He was the one who curated the work crew. I watched him do it weeks ago. He was so proud of that group. He had even added a hard hat emoji to the title to give it a sense of industrial gravitas. He had built the stage upon which he now stood exposed. I walked him through the process of deleting the messages from his end, but I had to deliver the cold, hard truth. I told him that deleting them from his screen didn't purge them from the world. Those images were sitting on servers in Cupertino. They were cached on 15 different devices. They were probably being backed up to iCloud as we spoke. Those feet are forever. They are a part of the permanent record now. The aftermath was even worse than the event itself. Rumors began to filter back from the office. Linda, the department's unofficial historian and keeper of all secrets, had acted with predatory speed. She hadn't just seen the photos. She had preserved them. She had captured the screen. She had taken the digital and made it physical. She had printed the evidence and posted it in the communal break room. She had turned my father's mistake into a piece of office folklore. The caption she chose was a work of linguistic genius. Gary's sole contribution to the team. It was a pun that cut deeper than any formal reprimand. My father didn't find it funny. He didn't see the art in it. He just saw the end of his dignity. But me? I think Linda deserves a promotion. She took a moment of absolute chaos and turned it into a legend. The Monday morning commute was a slow descent into a psychological war zone. My father sat in the driver's seat of his sedan, his hands gripping the steering wheel with enough force to turn his knuckles white. He wasn't just driving to a mid-level office complex in a suburban business park. He was driving into the heart of a memoir he never wanted written. He checked his reflection in the rearview mirror, adjusting his tie for the 4th time. He was looking for signs of weakness. He was looking for a version of himself that hadn't become a digital punchline. He kept mumbling about data privacy laws. He was convinced there was a legal loophole that could force his colleagues to undergo a collective memory wipe. He talked about the right to be forgotten. He talked about the sanctity of the domestic sphere. He was spiraling into a series of theoretical defenses that had no weight in the break room. When he stepped through the glass double doors of the lobby, the air felt different. The receptionist gave him a smile that lasted exactly 2 seconds too long. It wasn't the standard professional greeting. It was the look you give a person who has survived a very public and very strange disaster. He walked toward the elevators, keeping his eyes fixed on the floor. The very floor he had documented so thoroughly in his own home. Every step felt heavy. Every chime of the elevator felt like a countdown. He entered the car and stood in the back corner. A junior associate stepped in after him, looked at his shoes, and then looked away quickly, suppressing a cough that sounded suspiciously like a smothered laugh. My father realized then that the digital image had bridged the gap into the physical world. People weren't looking at his face anymore. They were looking at his feet. They were looking for the rash. They were looking for the tile. The departmental floor was a hive of activity that went silent the moment he crossed the threshold. It was a wave of quiet that followed him from the cubicles to his private office. He could see the back of Linda's head over the partition. She was typing with a rhythmic intensity that suggested she was already drafting the next chapter of his humiliation. He reached his desk and saw a small, wrapped package sitting on his keyboard. No note. No card. He unwrapped it with trembling fingers. It was a pair of industrial-strength wool socks. High performance, moisture-wicking, and thick enough to hide any anatomical detail from a satellite camera. He didn't throw them away. He didn't complain. He just put them in his bottom drawer next to the stapler and the emergency granola bars. He was being hazed by his own subordinates. The first meeting of the day was the weekly status update. This was usually a dry affair involving Gantt charts and budgetary projections. But today, the atmosphere was electric. My father took his seat at the head of the conference table. He tried to project an aura of executive authority. He opened his leather-bound notebook. He cleared his throat. Before he could speak, his boss leaned back in his chair and adjusted his glasses. He looked around the room and asked if everyone had seen the latest updates to the shared drive. There was a pause. A silence so thick you could have carved it with a scalpel. Then, a voice from the back of the room asked if the updates included any high-resolution assets. The room erupted. It wasn't a roar of laughter. It was a polite, corporate tittering that was far more damaging. It was the sound of a career hitting a ceiling made of bathroom porcelain. My father tried to pivot. He tried to dive into the logistics of the third-quarter rollout. He used terms like synergistic integration and paradigm shifting. He tried to drown the memory of his toes in a sea of professional jargon. But every time he moved his hands, he noticed people tracking the movement. Every time he shifted his weight in his chair, he heard the faint squeak of his leather shoes, and he knew what they were thinking. They were visualizing the bath mat. They were thinking about the shower caddy. He realized that he had lost the ability to be taken seriously. He was no longer the senior project manager. He was the foot guy. He was the man who didn't understand the basic architecture of his own smartphone. If you've ever had a nickname at work that you absolutely hated but couldn't shake, hit the like button so I know I'm in good company. By noon, the psychological toll was visible. He called me during his lunch break. He was hiding in his car in the parking lot. He told me he was thinking about early retirement. He talked about liquidating his 401k and moving to a cabin in the woods where the cellular reception was non-existent. He was convinced that Linda had more photos. He thought she had hacked into his cloud storage. He was convinced there was a secondary folder of even more embarrassing domestic snapshots waiting to be unleashed. I had to talk him down from the ledge. I told him he was overthinking the technical capabilities of his coworkers. Linda wasn't a black hat hacker. She was just a woman with a printer and a sense of timing. I told him he needed to lean into the joke. I told him he needed to own the narrative before the narrative owned him. He didn't listen. He went back inside and tried to file a formal grievance with human resources. He sat across from a 24-year-old HR coordinator who had clearly already seen the group chat. He tried to explain that the photo was a medical communication intended for his spouse. He used the term HIPAA violation, even though he doesn't work in healthcare and the law doesn't apply to private group chats. The coordinator listened with a pained expression of forced empathy. She told him that while the photo was certainly unconventional, it didn't technically violate the code of conduct unless he was claiming it was a form of harassment. He realized then that he was trapped in a gray area. He had harassed himself. He had committed a self-inflicted breach of professional decorum. The afternoon brought a new development. A vendor from a major software firm arrived for a scheduled presentation. This was a man who didn't know the backstory. He didn't know about the rash or the iPhone setup. He was there to sell a new suite of communication tools designed to streamline internal messaging. He started his presentation by talking about the dangers of fragmented communication. He spoke about the importance of choosing the right channel for the right message. He showed a slide of a person looking stressed at a computer screen. Then, he uttered the words that broke my father's spirit. He said, "We've all been there, sending something to the wrong person. It's the ultimate professional nightmare." My father felt the entire room turn to look at him. It was a synchronized movement. A chorus of silent witnesses. The vendor continued, oblivious to the carnage he was causing. He started demonstrating the recall feature of his new software. He showed how easy it was to delete a message from everyone's device with a single click. He called it the Dignity Saver. He joked that it was perfect for those late-night messages or accidental photos that should have stayed in the camera roll. The irony was so thick it was practically tangible. My father sat there, staring at the glowing projection on the wall, watching a simulated version of his own salvation. He realized that if he had just waited 2 weeks for this software rollout, his reputation would be intact. He was a man who had been defeated by a 2-week lag in procurement. He was a victim of timing and a lack of haptic precision. When the meeting ended, the vendor walked up to my father to shake his hand. He noticed the socks sitting on the desk. He commented on them. He said they looked like high-quality gear. He asked if my father was a hiker. My father didn't answer. He just stared at the man's hand until the vendor awkwardly pulled it back and left the room. My father then picked up his phone. He looked at the work crew chat. There was a new notification. It was a link to a blog post about the history of tile design in the mid-century modern era. It had been posted by the boss. It was a silent, digital nudge. A reminder that the internet never forgets, and your coworkers never let a good crisis go to waste. He realized he wasn't just a manager anymore. He was a piece of content. The drive home from the office that evening was a silent post-mortem of a dead career. My father didn't turn on the radio. He didn't check his navigation. He drove by muscle memory, his mind looping the image of that break room bulletin board like a cursed film strip. He pulled into the driveway and sat in the dark for 20 minutes, watching the glow of the neighbor's security lights. He was contemplating the digital footprint. He was realizing that every person he had ever supervised now possessed a permanent, high-resolution record of his bathroom floor. He walked through the front door and didn't greet my mother. He went straight to the kitchen table and began auditing his digital life. He was looking for other vulnerabilities. He was checking his privacy settings with the intensity of a forensic accountant. He was a man who had lost faith in the invisible hand of the user interface. He called me again at 10 o'clock. His voice was different this time. It wasn't the panic of the initial incident. It was a cold, calculated paranoia. He asked me if the iPhone had a way of secretly recording audio while it was in his pocket. He wanted to know if the device was mapping his biometric data without his consent. I explained the concept of sandboxing and app permissions. I tried to explain the hardware-level security of the T2 chip. He wasn't listening to the technical specifications. He was looking for a scapegoat. He told me he was convinced that the phone had prioritized the workgroup chat because of an algorithmic bias. He thought the artificial intelligence had identified his coworkers as his primary social circle and had nudged his thumb toward the send button. He was trying to blame the machine learning for his own lack of fine motor skills. I spent an hour on the phone explaining that there was no conspiracy. There was only the proximity of interface elements. I told him that the share sheet is designed for efficiency, not for the protection of a man's dignity. It assumes the user is operating with intentionality. He didn't like that answer. He wanted to hear that he had been the victim of a sophisticated cyber attack. He wanted to believe that a foreign entity had intercepted his dermatological data. It was easier to believe in a global shadow war than to admit he didn't know how to navigate a drop-down menu. He asked me to come over the next morning before work. He wanted me to perform a full factory reset. He wanted to wipe the slate clean, as if erasing the local data would somehow pull the images back from the cloud. When I arrived the next morning, he was standing in the kitchen with a stack of printed manuals he had found online. He had highlighted sections on data encryption and remote wipes. He looked like he hadn't slept. He handed me the phone like it was a live explosive. I performed the reset. I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen, a white line of digital amnesia. He watched it with a grim satisfaction. He thought he was winning. He thought he was reclaiming his privacy. But while the phone was resetting, his iPad chimed on the counter. Then his MacBook. The notifications were synced across the entire ecosystem. The work crew chat was still active. A new message had arrived from a coworker named Brenda. She had posted a photo of her own breakfast, a bowl of oatmeal, with the caption, "Thought I'd share some textures too." The room went cold. My father realized the fundamental flaw in his plan. You can wipe the device, but you cannot wipe the network. He saw the oatmeal. He saw the subtext. It was a secondary wave of mockery, a ripple effect from the initial splash. He realized that the incident had moved beyond a single mistake. It had become a cultural touchstone within the department. He was the catalyst for a new era of oversharing. He sat down and put his head in his hands. He asked me if there was a way to sue Apple for emotional distress. He wanted to know if there was a class action lawsuit for people who had been betrayed by the share sheet. I had to tell him that the terms and conditions he had accepted without reading likely exempted the company from the consequences of his own thumb. If you've ever scrolled through 100 pages of legal jargon just to hit agree so you could use an app, hit the like button because we are all living in Gary's world now. We are all one misplaced tap away from a total reputational collapse. My father looked at the iPad and then at the freshly reset iPhone. He reached out and pushed the phone away from him. He said he wanted his old flip phone back. He wanted a device that couldn't see, couldn't hear, and certainly couldn't transmit images of his feet to his superiors. He wanted to go back to a world where a mistake was a spoken word that vanished into the air, not a file that sat on a server for the rest of eternity. He was a digital refugee in his own kitchen. He went to work that day with a new strategy. He decided to play the role of the wounded statesman. He wouldn't acknowledge the oatmeal. He wouldn't acknowledge the socks in his drawer. He would operate with such a high level of professional intensity that the memory of his foot would be buried under a mountain of productivity. He called an emergency meeting for 2 o'clock. He prepared a deck of 45 slides. He practiced his delivery in the mirror. He was going to pivot the entire department toward a new mission statement. He was going to use sheer corporate velocity to outrun the shame. He walked into the conference room and didn't look at the bulletin board. He didn't look at Linda. He started the presentation before the last person had even sat down. For 30 minutes, it worked. He was a machine. He was rattling off KPIs and deliverables with the precision of an automated system. He felt the power returning to his hands. He felt the room shifting back under his control. He reached the final slide, the one titled Next Steps in Global Strategy. He went to plug his phone into the projector to show a live demo of the new client portal. He had forgotten that the factory reset had changed his wallpaper back to the default. He had forgotten that his notifications were now set to show full previews on the lock screen. As the image hit the big screen, a notification popped up in real time. It was a message from my mother. It was a photo of a tube of antifungal cream with the text, "Gary, I bought the stuff for your foot. Hope it clears up soon." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room. The entire department was now looking at a 10-foot-tall projection of a medical recommendation for the very foot they had all spent the last 48 hours discussing. The loop was closed. The mystery of the rash was solved. The professional facade my father had spent the morning building didn't just crack, it disintegrated. He stood there, silhouetted against the image of the cream, a man whose private medical history was now the centerpiece of a global strategy meeting. He didn't even try to unplug the cable. He just stood there, staring at the wall, watching his dignity evaporate in the blue light of the projector. He didn't finish the meeting. He didn't say another word. He just closed his laptop, picked up his bag, and walked out of the room. He didn't go to his office. He didn't stop at the break room to tear down Linda's poster. He walked straight to the parking lot. He drove to a local park and sat on a bench for 3 hours, watching a group of teenagers play soccer. He watched them running, their feet protected by cleats, their lives still unburdened by the complexities of professional optics. He felt like an alien who had landed in a world he didn't understand. He realized that the iPhone wasn't just a phone. It was an oracle that revealed the truth whether you wanted it to or not. It was a mirror that never stopped reflecting. He returned home that evening with the heavy tread of a man who had officially resigned from the human race. He didn't even take off his shoes. He went straight to the liquor cabinet and poured a glass of scotch that was 3 fingers deep. He sat in his armchair, the one with the frayed upholstery he refused to replace, and stared at the dark screen of the television. He was waiting for the phone to ring. He was waiting for the call from Human Resources telling him that his presence was no longer required. He was waiting for the official notification that he had been categorized as a liability. He felt the weight of the device in his pocket. It felt like a stone. A tether to a reality he no longer wished to inhabit. He pulled it out and looked at it. The smooth glass was covered in his own fingerprints. A roadmap of his failures. The next morning, he didn't go to work. He didn't call in sick. He didn't send an email to the work crew. He just stayed in bed, watching the sunlight move across the ceiling. He was practicing a form of professional ghosting. He was trying to see if he could simply cease to exist in the corporate consciousness. He thought that if he stopped responding, the data would eventually degrade. He thought the bitrot would take over and eat the images of his feet. But the notifications didn't stop. His phone buzzed on the nightstand with a relentless, mechanical precision. It was the digital heartbeat of a world that refused to let him go. He finally reached out and swiped the screen. It wasn't a message from his boss. It wasn't a snarky comment from Linda. It was a LinkedIn notification. Someone had viewed his profile. Then another. Then 6 more. He opened the app and saw that his profile views metric had spiked by 400% in 24 hours. He checked the list. It wasn't just his coworkers. It was recruiters from rival firms. It was industry consultants. It was people from his past he hadn't spoken to in a decade. He realized that the story had migrated. It had breached the containment of the office group chat. It had leaked into the wider professional ecosystem. Someone had shared a screenshot of the sole contribution poster. Someone had turned his domestic catastrophe into a viral cautionary tale about digital literacy in the C-suite. He was no longer just a local joke. He was a global case study in what happens when a legacy manager meets a modern interface. He called me in a state of absolute existential crisis. He asked me if there was a way to scrub the entire internet. He wanted to know the cost of a digital reputation management firm. He talked about right-to-be-forgotten legislation in the European Union, wondering if he could claim temporary residency in France to trigger a legal deletion. I had to be the one to tell him that the internet doesn't have a recycle bin. It only has a mirror. I told him that the more he fought it, the more oxygen he gave the fire. I told him that the only way out was through. If you've ever had to explain the Streisand effect to a parent while they were having a mental breakdown, hit the like button. It is a specific type of labor that should be tax deductible. The knowledge gap was the worst part. He didn't know who had leaked it. He didn't know if it was Linda, or the boss, or the 24-year-old HR coordinator who had looked at him with such pity. He didn't know if they were talking about him in other chats. He didn't know if there was a subreddit dedicated to middle-aged men failing at technology. The mystery of the leak was a phantom that haunted every room of his house. He began to suspect everyone. He looked at the mailman with suspicion. He wondered if the neighbors were whispering about his tile work. He was living in a panopticon of his own making. He decided that the only way to regain a sense of agency was to confront the source. Not the phone. Not the people. The feet themselves. He went to the bathroom. He looked at the floor. The famous tile. The bath mat that had been seen by thousands. He realized that the physical world was now an extension of the digital one. He couldn't look at his own bathroom without seeing the framing of the photograph. He saw the world in aspect ratios now. He saw his life as a series of potential uploads. He grabbed a hammer from the garage. He came back and began to smash the tile. He swung with a rhythmic, desperate violence. He was trying to destroy the evidence. He was trying to alter the crime scene. He worked until his arms ached and the floor was a ruin of ceramic shards and dust. He felt a brief, flickering sense of triumph. He had deleted the physical file. But then he looked down at his hands. They were covered in white dust. He looked at the shower caddy, still standing there, an indifferent witness to his breakdown. He realized that breaking the tile didn't change the data on the servers. It just meant he now had a broken bathroom and a ruined reputation. He sat on the edge of the tub and started to laugh. It wasn't a healthy laugh. It was the sound of a man who had finally accepted the absurdity of his position. He realized he was a character in a story he wasn't writing. He was a footnote in the history of the smartphone. He picked up his phone one last time. He opened the work crew chat. He saw 32 unread messages. He didn't read them. He scrolled to the very top, to the first photo of his foot. He looked at the image with a strange sense of detachment. He noticed the lighting. He noticed the composition. He realized that, for all the trauma it had caused, it was actually a very high-quality photograph. The triple lens system had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had captured the truth with terrifying clarity. He saw the ridges of his skin. He saw the subtle colors of the marble. He realized that he had accidentally created a piece of hyperrealistic art. He felt a sudden, perverse sense of pride. He had mastered the hardware. He had used the technology to its fullest extent. He just hadn't mastered the intent. He was a virtuoso without a score. He was a pilot who had crashed the plane perfectly. He decided to return to the office the next day. But he didn't go in his suit. He didn't go in his tie. He wore a pair of expensive, designer sandals. He didn't wear socks. He walked through the lobby with his head held high. He walked past the receptionist. He walked into the break room. He stood in front of the bulletin board where his foot was still pinned to the cork. He didn't tear it down. He took out a black marker. He leaned in and signed the bottom of the printout. He wrote his name in a bold, cursive script. He added a date. He turned around to see a crowd had gathered in the doorway. Linda was at the front, her mouth slightly open. The boss was standing behind her, his arms crossed. The silence was different this time. It wasn't the silence of mockery. It was the silence of a group of people who had just seen a man perform a feat of social alchemy. He had taken his greatest shame and turned it into a brand. He looked at the room and said, "I've decided to lean into the soul contribution. I'm starting a departmental initiative on transparency." He walked past them and went to his office. He sat down and opened his laptop. He had 3 offers from consulting firms specializing in digital crisis management. He had an invitation to speak at a conference on the human element of cybersecurity. He realized that in the attention economy, a mistake isn't a failure. It's a foundation. He looked at his phone. He had a new message from me. I asked him how he was doing. He replied with a single emoji. A foot. The transformation was total. My father had bypassed the traditional stages of grief and landed directly on a lucrative new identity. He spent the rest of the afternoon responding to the consulting offers with a clinical efficiency. He used terms like brand repositioning and narrative reclamation. He was speaking the language of the very people who had spent the last week dismantling his dignity. He realized that the professional world didn't actually value competence or discretion as much as it valued visibility. He had become a high-volume asset in a low-attention market. He looked at the hard hat emoji in the group chat title and realized it was no longer a joke. It was a symbol of the structural work he was doing on his own legend. He was the architect of the aftermath. He called a meeting for the following morning. It wasn't a status update. It wasn't a project review. He titled the calendar "Invite the Architecture of the Accident." When the team filed into the conference room, they found a single slide projected on the wall. It was a zoomed-in, cropped version of the original photo. Just the tile. Just the texture. He stood at the front of the room with a laser pointer. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge the socks in the drawer or the antifungal cream. He talked about the intersection of human error and technological design. He talked about how the user interface is a mirror of our own subconscious biases. He was gaslighting the entire department into believing that his accidental foot post was actually a deep-cover sociological experiment. The room was mesmerized. They wanted to believe him. They wanted to believe that their supervisor wasn't just a man who didn't know how to use a smartphone, but a visionary who had dared to be vulnerable in a corporate space. Linda was taking notes with a frantic, renewed respect. Even the boss was nodding, his eyes fixed on the porcelain tile. My father had successfully navigated the most difficult maneuver in the corporate playbook. He had turned a fireable offense into a leadership philosophy. He told them that from now on, the work crew would be a space of radical honesty. He encouraged them to share their own soul contributions. He had taken the teeth out of the mockery by inviting everyone into the cage. If you've ever seen a person flip the script so hard that you almost forgot they were the one who messed up in the first place, hit the like button. I was watching a masterclass in survival. I was watching my father, a man who 3 days ago was ready to move into a cave, become the most influential person in the building. He came home that night and showed me his new follower count on LinkedIn. He had been tagged in a post by a tech CEO who called him a pioneer of the authentic management movement. He was being invited to podcasts. He was being asked to write an op-ed for a major business journal. The iPhone had given him a career that 30 years of hard work never could. But the real test came later that night. We were sitting in the living room, the glow of the television flickering against the walls. He picked up his phone. He opened the camera. He looked at me with a mischievous glint in his eye. He pointed the lens at his other foot. The one that hadn't gone viral. He paused. His thumb hovered over the white shutter button. For a second, the old Gary returned. The man who was afraid of the machine. The man who worried about the cloud and the servers and the permanent record. He looked at the screen, then at me. He asked if I thought the world was ready for the sequel. He was joking, but there was a sliver of truth in it. He had tasted the power of the broadcast. I told him to put the phone down. I told him he had peaked. I told him that lightning doesn't strike twice on the same bath mat. He laughed and locked the screen. He said he finally understood what I had been trying to tell him about the ecosystem. It's not about the hardware. It's not about the software. It's about the story you tell with the tools you're given. He had been trying to fight the interface when he should have been leaning into the output. He looked at his hand, the one that had committed the fatal send, and he didn't see a failure anymore. He saw a strategic instrument. He was a digital native now, baptized in the fire of his own embarrassment. The next week, the break room poster was gone. It hadn't been torn down in anger. It had been framed. Someone had taken the printout and put it in a sleek, black gallery frame with a small brass plaque that read Gary's pivot. It was no longer a joke, it was an artifact. It was a reminder that in the modern office, your reputation is a fluid state. It can be solid one moment and gas the next. My father walked past it every morning and gave it a small, respectful nod. He had reached a level of professional immunity that was almost godlike. He could do no wrong because he had already done the absolute worst thing possible and survived. He eventually bought me a new laptop as a thank you for the technical support. He told me it was a consulting fee for my role in his transition to a thought leader. He still asks me for help with his settings, but the tone is different now. He doesn't blame me when things go wrong. He just asks how he can use the glitch to his advantage. He's looking for the next incident. He's waiting for the next accidental upload that will propel him into the next tax bracket. He's no longer afraid of the blue bubbles. He's no longer afraid of the group chat. He is the king of the work crew. He is the man with the hard hat and the high-resolution feet. I stood in his newly retiled bathroom a few months later. He had chosen a dark, slate gray. It was matte, sophisticated, and looked incredible under the LED vanity lights. He asked me if I wanted to take a picture of it. I told him I think we've had enough photos of his bathroom for one lifetime. He smiled and walked out, his designer sandals clicking against the new stone. I looked at the floor and thought about the data packets that had changed our lives. I thought about the millions of people who were one thumb slip away from their own soul contribution. The world is a fragile place, held together by glass and silicon and the thin hope that we don't hit send before we're ready. As I left the house, I checked my own phone. I had a notification from the family group chat. My father had posted a link to his latest article. The title was "Why Your Greatest Mistake is Your Best Marketing Tool." Attached to the post was a small, thumbnail image of a bathroom tile. It was a professional headshot, but in the background, if you looked closely, you could see the corner of a shower caddy. He was playing the long game. He was keeping the lore alive. He had become the thing he once feared. He was a content creator. He was a brand. He was Gary. And his feet were, and always will be, forever.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe Family Files for more.